So our panel today is going to be about separating science fact from science fiction. And we've spent the morning really hearing about the importance of making knowledge accessible and democratizing knowledge, something that we can all certainly support and get behind. But what we want to explore today is the obstacles to that and thinking a little bit more deeply about things we need to be wary of, so that especially not just broader knowledge, but certainly science and the whole agenda of fake news is reported accurately. So we're joined by three panelists this morning from slightly different backgrounds. On my left here, we've got Ritu Dhand, who is Vice President of Nature Journals. So Ritu was appointed Nature Editorial Director in May 2014, and earlier this year, Vice President of Nature Journals, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, high-impact journals. And in this role, she's responsible for overseeing editorial strategy and management of Nature and Nature Communications, the Nature Research and Review journals. She's very passionate about research integrity and reproducibility, and has been experimenting with increasing transparency and peer review and promoting open research. Ritu, however, is a true scientist, her words, not mine. Before joining Nature, she spent time as a cancer researcher, completing her PhD at the Ludwig Institute for Cancer Research and UCL, with a postdoctoral fellowship at the Samuel Lunenfeld Research Institute, Mount Sinai Hospital in Toronto. She also studied genetics at Queen Mary and Westfield College. On my right here, we've got Fiona Fox from Science Media Centre. So Fiona has a degree in journalism and many years of experience in working in media relations for high-profile national organisations. She has a long career working for Equal Opportunities Committee, the National Council for One-Parent Families, and CAFOD, a leading aid agency. But bringing it back to today, Fiona was the founding director of the Science Media Centre, set up back in 2002, and has really built it into an indispensable resource for science journalists, with 3,000 of the UK's top scientists on their media database. Moving on, we've got Tyler Stanage, who is a scientist just across the road at the Francis Crick Institute, studying the process of how cells repair damaged DNA and the effects this process has on cancer and other diseases. So Tyler joins us from the US, where he's witnessed the rise of the anti-vaccine movement following flawed news coverage and the real impact it has on people's lives. So he has a PhD in biochemistry from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and a BSc in biochemistry from Indiana University, Bloomington. So we've got three very, very qualified people here to talk about this subject. And what we really want to consider today is the issues that we face as a society when science is inaccurately interpreted and reported and hyped up, and really consider the roles of researchers, the media, publishers in getting the balance right, in reporting complex science responsibly, whilst at the same time making it accessible and democratizing it. So we're going to start by asking each of them from their perspectives to summarize how they feel the current state of science reporting is happening in mainstream UK media today. So Fiona, as our journalist on the panel, let's start with you.
Thanks, Emma. So I think I'm actually quite an optimist about all this. I feel quite positive. So in my time, I've been at the Science Media Centre for 17 years. I've watched science move from the kind of "and finally," do you remember that at the end of the news with the fluffy animal story? And now I think science is really on the front pages, whether it's statins or e-cigs or plastics or human genome editing, climate change, regularly getting the news headlines. We've got a fantastic ecosystem now of scientists, science press officers and science journalists working together to report amazing and important science to a mass audience on a daily basis. So I think there's lots to celebrate here. I know a lot of people really like criticising media coverage of science, but at very close proximity to it, I see lots to celebrate. But let me say a couple of things about fake news. Firstly, and quite emphatically, because I think everybody is just using this term way too often, I don't see any fake news in science. If you accept the definition as entirely made up, fabricated news, which then spreads quickly around the world, I challenge you to give me an example of fake news in science. What we do have is news which is very misleading, inaccurate, hyped, exaggerated, but without sounding too old-fashioned, 'twas ever thus. I mean, it's always been like that. So what do I worry about? I worry about the failure of everybody in this mix to distinguish between the kinds of science which is reliable and should be trusted and that which is unreliable and shouldn't be trusted. I think if you looked at the vast majority of headlines, you will see that the studies are observational studies, so X is linked to Y. For example, there are thousands, but too much screen time linked to depression in teenagers. But when you look at these studies, it's impossible to say whether one caused the other. We don't know whether being on screens caused the teenagers to become depressed or whether depressed teenagers tend to spend more time on their screens. Crucially, we cannot know from this kind of study because they're not designed to find a cause or a biological mechanism. Yet this kind of evidence is on the front pages every day. Similarly, there are studies that are at a very preliminary stage. So perhaps just an abstract at a conference. Twice this week, you will have seen fertility stories on the front pages from the ESHRI conference, the European Fertility Conference. They're abstracts. They've never been published in a journal. They probably won't be published in a journal. When I ask third-party scientists to look at the data and say, is it a good study, there isn't any data. It's just an abstract, so I can't even get the scientists to assess whether it's good. In contrast, we've got other studies like Cochrane's or network meta-analysis or randomized control trials done on humans, which are really good quality evidence and can tell us things about what works and how. And my worry is that the news media is really not very good at distinguishing between these. And you've seen my studies. I know my studies are very important. You probably do them. But conference abstracts and observational studies getting this kind of front page news. And I think that's really misleading to the public.
Okay. Tyler, we'll come back to some of those.
Yeah, I think I agree a lot with Fiona, what she just said. From my perspective as a scientist, I agree with many of the points in terms of correlative studies being reported as causative studies, so things X causes Y. And that's the number one question I get when I do outreach events here at the Francis Crick Institute specifically, is it true that, and ... and then they usually cite some sort of recent news story. But what I can say about, I've been here for about a year now from the US, is that I'm also very optimistic in terms of the UK's ability to report on science, especially compared to the US, and that's a very broad stroke. But I'm confident in saying that because of the amount of science, as Fiona said, that I've been exposed to just by going about my normal day and not seeking out the science news. And so that's one of the things that I think we have to focus on, is that there's about 3 to 4 different groups of people that consume science news. There's people like me who are quote-unquote experts on certain things, but definitely not others. For example, I know nothing about space or physics or engineering or anything of that sort. I'm mostly focused on biological processes. So people that have specific expertise. And then there's another group of people who are just really, really interested in science. And I think these people go and they seek out these stories, whether it's from the BBC and then they click on the link to the actual article and then read through the abstract if it's available, go through the data, that sort of thing, and just really, really interested in that sort of science. And then I think one of probably the largest group, the third group, are people who will see it just like I have, just casually browsing the BBC website or on Twitter or social media in general, and oftentimes we'll take the headline as it is and then say, oh, I saw this on this website, and have taken that as scientific fact, which I think it's a responsibility on many ends, and I think we have to work toward a better way of conveying that science, not just through a headline, but being much more accessible to that group that is very large and is oftentimes making decisions in their own personal lives, but also political lives, in order to use that scientific fact in order to affect the lives of others. And so I think we have a huge responsibility, not only as scientists, but as journalists as well, in order to bridge the divide from people like me, scientists who are not particularly great at communicating science, to journalists who are very well versed in communicating in general and sort of marrying the two into a better partnership. And as far as I'm concerned, right now it's pretty strong in the UK, but of course, as Fiona mentioned, there are some issues that we'll be probably talking about later, but it's quite nice.
Okay, Ritu.
I'm going to echo a lot of what Fiona and Tyler have said. As Emma said earlier, I work at Nature. We have the privilege of communicating some of the biggest breakthroughs, milestones in science publishing. And in terms of how that is reported, the standard is very, very high. But does that happen on its own? I don't think so. We have a very active press team. The press team are there to translate these breakthroughs into a language that journalists understand. The press team supplies supporting material to make that finding more accessible. We will put on a press conference so that journalists can actually ask questions to the researchers to gain a better understanding and to clarify anything that they're not sure about. We give journalists lead time so that they can investigate these findings. They can talk to experts, which the Science Media Centre might put forward about this finding. And we will work with the press offices of these authors, be it their funding bodies, be it their institutes, to make that research more accessible. So there's a lot that goes on behind the scenes to ensure more accurate reporting in the mainstream media. But is that the case across scientific sort of publishing? No, it definitely isn't. Not every publishing house or publisher will have a press office. Not every institute or funding body will have a press office to help support the communication of science. And you know, as Fiona says, there's very little to none science that is totally made up by the journalist. But there is a lot of inaccurate reporting. And there's, you know, from where I sit, three basic ways that I would summarize that. There is a level of sensationalism. The tabloid press have invested in high-quality scientific reporters who, you know, they have bylines, they are named. It's their reputation at stake if they report inaccurately. But, you know, for the masses, in sort of the non-specialist outlets, where it's important that someone clicks on a headline or the news story actually sells, there is going to be more sort of incentive to hype, not to not tell the truth, but to not tell all the truth. There's another part of this that comes into it, which I think Tyler alluded to, and that's accessibility of the actual scientific paper. Scientists write for their colleagues who are specialists. They don't need to explain the context. They don't need to say, why should I care? They don't need to say, what are the implications? Because the only people that they care about understanding their research are their immediate colleagues who know all of that. And so that makes it very, very difficult for the journalists, for the media outlets to actually report on the swathes of scientific papers that there are out there. That leads to two things. There is a selection bias on what is reported. There will be a lot of stories out there on Earth, planets, environment, space, you know, animals, behavior, all the sort of stuff that you can actually read a paper and kind of get why the journalist is reporting on, the scientist is reporting on something. And then the other thing that the journalist is going to be looking for is, what do my readers care about? What will they relate to? And that invariably purports to health or the human behaviors or happenings. And that's where problems start. You know, every day you will read, we've cured cancer, which is simply not true. You know, cancer is not one disease in the first instance, and we certainly haven't cured all cancers. But if you take it from the journalist's perspective, the actual detail that is reported in a scientific paper is so difficult to understand. The jargon, the incremental advance actually made. What could they possibly say in a tabloid sort of paper that people would take as a take-home message? So the bottom line ends up being we're a step closer to curing cancer, but how many times do we read that, and what does that actually mean? And if we're still a million steps away, how significant is that? But I don't lay that at the door of the social media or the science journalists. That's the researchers. And the researchers can do more, but so can the publishing houses. We can do more to help make more scientific reporting accessible. And there's a third factor that comes into play. And that, unfortunately, is the accuracy of the scientific research that's reported. And here, you know, I will bring up the infamous Wakefield paper in 1998, where Wakefield reported that the triple vaccine caused autism. And, you know, it's one of the biggest scientific frauds, as it were, that we've had in a long time, because it had real health implications. 2009, there was the re-emergence, especially in London, of chickenpox and in other areas, because there were people out there that stopped vaccinating their children. And that research was highly flawed. The design was terrible. There was 12 patients in it. There was bias everywhere. Conflicts of interest weren't revealed. The paper was subsequently retracted. It took 12 years for it to be retracted, and the damage has not yet been undone. But that is not at the door of the journalist either. That paper should never have been published. And, you know, I work at Nature, and we take our jobs very, very seriously. We don't want to publish anything that we think, you know, could have that kind of impact or be wrong in any way, but sometimes it can happen. So I think there's a lot of factors in play that lead to inaccurate scientific reporting. But I also think it's much better than it used to be, and we see a lot more science reporting, which is fantastic. But I still think there's a lot we can do to make it better.
Okay, and leading on to some of the themes you've all picked up and from this morning about science discoveries being on the front pages, being on the 10 o'clock news. Why do you think that's important, and at what point do you think the public should be made aware of these scientific discoveries? You talk about extracts, and you know, you're halfway through the research. But that's still making the front pages. At what point do you feel these discoveries should be made public?
Do you know what I really would love if we didn't have them in the media until they were published? Just everybody be patient. I don't understand why all these journalists are now going to these conferences, which used to be where scientists would go to a scientific meeting, publish their abstract, perfectly good. This is my hypothesis. This is what I'm trying to find. This is how I will do it. And all the other scientists in the meeting would either say, brilliant, I'll collaborate with you, or somebody will say, it's already been done, reproducibility. It's already been done by someone else, don't do it. Or someone will say, your methods are absolutely terrible. That was fantastic, but now journalists go. So it's not just other scientists speaking to each other. Journalists are going. They've got the ESRI conference I mentioned is in Vienna. They've got to justify to their newspapers, who have not got much money anymore, flying to Vienna. And so they report these stories. And the thing is, it's just a matter of time. If they're good, they will get through peer review and they will get published. So it's not like these stories would be censored. And of course, any journalist can go to a lab and, you know, go to Crick and find out what you're doing. I'm not saying nothing should ever be written about, but as a finding, as a piece of news, as something you should look at and think,
As a
right, this is,
conclusion.
as a conclusion, why can't we wait? And now we've got preprint. I mean, I've no idea whether anyone in the room knows about preprint, but, you know, fantastic, wonderful development for scientists. Again, for scientists, your point, Rita, really, you know, they're talking to each other. They're very excited about preprint, but now they're going to be on public. So as soon as your paper's done but hasn't been through peer review or published, you put it on a preprint server, which all scientists are being encouraged to do, and then journalists can find it and report it. And what if that's, you know, we've kind of sorted out Wakefield, I think, or there's been a lot of learning from Wakefield. But I could almost name you, better not for libel reasons, the kind of people that I'm worried about putting something on a preprint, because they make outlandish claims with very little evidence. There's a guy at the moment talking about vaccines causing autism still in a university, in a respected university.
I think you have to ask, who are you reporting to?
Yeah.
What is the point of this reporting? Who are you trying to reach? If you're trying to reach the lay public, it should be perfect. It should be peer-reviewed. It should be correct. Because they only want to know, or they should only want to know, about stuff that is authenticated.
It's tried and tested.
Tried and tested, validated, verified. If your preprint servers are a fantastic thing, but they're for the scientific community to talk to each other because they understand the caveats of what is being put into these big repositories, basically. They know it's not peer-reviewed, they may know it's not wrong, but more so, most of them will be technically qualified to read the paper and make that assessment themselves. The lay public cannot do that.
And we talked earlier about putting it into context as well, so the scientists will know what other papers are published in that domain as well, and so we'll be able to place that paper and those findings alongside others and do the comparison and reach the scientific conclusion.
That's right.
Rather than in isolation.
So I think you have to consider your audience, and I think journalists have a responsibility to report to the lay public accurately. Conferences and preprint servers don't do that on their own. That doesn't mean that all journalists reporting from a conference or a preprint server aren't responsible. Those journalists that actually go out and talk to other scientists to get comment on that piece of research, what do they think, effectively doing peer review informally, they may be acting responsibly, but it's hard. That's a hard way of doing it. So I think it's horses for courses, really. And everyone who is communicating science has to act responsibly, because it's a huge responsibility that you have.
And Tyler, in your experience as a researcher and carrying out ongoing research at the moment, how do you feel about the timing of the release of your findings and the need to constantly communicate, or whether it should be only at the very end?
I think it should be, there's many ways. It's who you're communicating with, absolutely. So with the scientific community, we have these conferences, and there's varying stages of how close is it to publication. And you go through a vetting process, basically. You have the first internal vetting process, which is your own laboratory, saying this might not be right, this may be right. Your group leader usually, or someone who is heading the laboratory, will do that vetting as well. And then you have colleagues within your immediate area. So the Crick is good for that, because we have so many different scientists that are many different expertise. But the ultimate test of your findings is peer review. 3 to 4 scientists in your field that are not affiliated with you whatsoever, no bias whatsoever, to just take an unbiased view of the data and say, do your conclusions match the data you have? And before that's done, even on preprints, there's an understanding in the scientific community that preprints are, again, they're a fantastic tool to communicate within science, but they are not a finished product. It's the working draft of, literally, it's the working draft of the manuscript that we put out as the main goals of and the main evidence of what we have done. And a more selfish view is that at conferences and these papers, again, when we have a CV, this is the #1 thing that we have on our CVs as researchers, are papers, manuscripts. And so these are things that we invest not only our time in, the taxpayers' money in, but also our lives in, and they are what separates us from others when competing for one job place, for example. And so if you have reporting at conferences of these unfinished findings that you haven't already submitted to a journal to be peer-reviewed, you run the risk of publicizing data that is what you've been working on for so long, and unfortunately there's the possibility that other researchers, it's called being scooped, is when someone else will take that research and they may be a more high-powered lab with more money, and they'll reach the conclusion before you do, or in a better way. So that runs that risk, and that is an awful thing that is very anti-collaborative, which is how, in my opinion, science should never be run in an anti-collaborative way. And unfortunately, though, it's the reality of the environment of scientific research in general. So for all those reasons, I completely agree that the reporting should come at the final stages or after it's been through peer review and accepted with all the changes done, so that we know for sure that this is my last product. It's the same thing, same standard we have for pretty much any other occupation. You don't judge a news article, an investigative story based on its very first, without contacting all the sources and things like that first. You have to vet it, and then you have a final product. It's published online or in print, and then you judge those conclusions. It's the exact same thing for the science field.
So where's the pressure coming from, do you think, for the reporting? Is it technology and the rise of social media? Is there pressure from government as it's publicly funded research? Is it journalists trying to get the scoop? Where do we think the pressure's coming from? Or is it a thirst from the general public to know more and have access to information?
I think everywhere is the right answer, because there's varying pressures in terms of communicating the science. There's many pressures in science, many of which come from funding your laboratory is the #1, I would say. Continue to do what you want to do and publishing your research. And so the main one would come from the funding agencies that have certain stipulations on what you can do with the money, which makes sense, there absolutely should be. But at the same time, yeah, so you basically, pressures come from everywhere, and there's not one place to blame in terms of the pressures for reporting your science. But yeah.
I think the appetite is huge, and we all, Tim Radford, I don't know if people remember him, he was the science editor on The Guardian, and a good friend of mine, but he talks about what he sees as the golden age, when he would kind of leave the office and go and travel to a university in Edinburgh just on spec and meet some of their scientists and find a story. And I love it when he talks about that, but what he means is that The Guardian were quite happy with one story a week from Tim, so he could swan off. And now if you look at Ian Sample and Hannah Devlin and all the people on The Guardian now, they're doing 3 or 4 stories a day. Yeah. They do, getting out of the office and going, it's really difficult. So, but that's a good thing, isn't it? That's back to my "and finally" versus this appetite for science and health stories. But because I'm a press officer, I work with a lot of press officers, and I totally agree, like the journal Nature press team are amazing. And they care about getting the science out there, but they care about accuracy. They very often phone us and say, we've got a fantastic paper, but we think it will be over-reported, and we're really nervous about that. Will you find third-party experts to kind of pour cold water? So there are really responsible press officers in the mix, but there are press officers under a lot of pressure. So without naming names, there are universities around the country who now, I'm sure you all know this about universities, see their PR people as selling an education to a customer rather than selling scientific research or being open to scrutiny. So they're under pressure to get brand recognition, so to get name checks. So when you're talking to them about reporting responsibly, some of them, certainly the people who've come through the science route, but if your head of media comes from ASDA and their job, and they're going to, in their appraisal, they're going to get judged on how many new students did we attract and were they happy, and then it's about reputation, brand recognition, and some of that stuff, they don't really care whether it's on a preprint or it's at a conference. They're going to do a press release and say, we're approaching a cure for cancer. So it's a real mix. You're absolutely right. All of those pressures exist, and we need to manage them at every level.
I think the way we communicate's changed. We used to be happy to, you know, with Tim Radford wrote his one story a week on the Sunday or whatever day it was that it came out. That was the day that we looked for it. Now we're expecting it on our Twitter feed every day. And the second we don't get it on our Twitter feed every day, we change our feed, because obviously that's not a great feed. That demand for by the day, by the hour has changed the landscape. I'm not sure it's for the better either, but that has had a huge impact on everything. And if you're reporting by the day, you've got less time to investigate, you've got less time to check. Your quality standards, unless you've, you know, a company is invested in, you know, 2,000 journalists putting out all of these feeds, you've got less time to do all of that quality checking. And, you know, it's not just science reporting that this has affected, it's affected everything. It's affected our daily lives and what we have to deal with.
And I think, like you say, it's in a good way, because things are a lot more accessible and they're here and they're now. But at the same time, there is a bigger problem, I think, with social media, in that everybody becomes an expert and everybody has a view, everybody has an opinion. And the more that goes on through the day, the more opinions and influence can change and hype the story even further.
So it spreads like wildfire.
So do you think social media companies have a responsibility around this?
Yes. You know, if things are wrong, if people are reporting things that they know are accurately, you know, are definitely wrong, they have a responsibility to take whatever it is down. But, you know, how quick things spread in minutes. You know, by the time it gets to head office or whoever is responsible for, can you monitor social media responsibly? Is that possible? Because a Twitter storm's over in 24 hours. You know, it's come, it's peaked, it's gone. You can't.
But the influence that it can have
stays.
And it
Absolutely.
stays.
So this is possibly the first time there's been a slight bit of disagreement on the panel. It's not really disagreement, because I totally agree with you, but I've been really looking at the influence of social media versus mainstream media. And I think, again, I don't want to just sound happy about everything, but again, I'm quite encouraged by some of the more recent surveys. So Public Health England did a really detailed one, which they do every 2 years, I gather, asking people where you get your information about vaccines. I mean, talk about fake news, you've got Matt Hancock stipulating that there's a major MMR crisis because of anti-vaccination information circulating on social media. There's actually no MMR crisis. There was. You know, and there's trends that are worrying globally. There's no MMR crisis, and there's no compelling evidence that parents who aren't vaccinated, which is very few in the UK, are not because of social media. And I urge you to look at that survey, because it was actually something like 90% of parents said that they look to health professionals or health professionals' websites on the internet to get their information. And there was another poll that the Guardian did, a global monitor or something, which again was really reassuring about, we go to social media for our fun and we yell at each other and we shout and we share things, and then when we want to know the truth, we go back to television news, you know, 85% or something. So I don't disagree with you, and I think in terms of the speed at which things go and the reach and all of that is true, and it would be really stupid of us not to investigate and look at that. But some of that investigation is happening and some of it is more reassuring.
The only thing I would add to that, Fiona, and I don't disagree with anything you said, but social media is now not fun anymore. It is where accurate, professional, scientific reporting is taking place. Scientists now hear about papers through their Twitter feeds. It's not a fun thing anymore. It's used as a professional tool to learn quickly about scientific findings. So if this has become a forum for professional learning, then there is a danger that you won't readily one day dismiss everything that you see on a Twitter feed or social media, because lay public can't be expected to work out when it's real and when it's not, if it's a forum used by professionals. Nature tweets every paper they publish because scientists read us via their Twitter feed.
And so as a scientist then, Tyler, do you feel that as a scientist you're becoming more media savvy, that you are using social media to communicate your findings and your papers so that other scientists read it, but again, working out who your audience is, knowing that the general public are also going to do that, and is that a good thing, or is it hyping the issue?
Yeah, so we usually have a reputation for being pretty introverted and not sharing our feelings or findings often. So I do see a huge trend that more people, labs especially, so the whole lab will have a Twitter feed, and they will talk about their science, but more importantly, I think, to give this goes to the fun aspect, is to give an inside view of what a scientist does every single day, because I'm sure everyone has an idea, and it's probably not what I do every day. Most of it's working at a bench, but also at the computer, so it's a lot like a normal office job. But I think overall, it's hard to say if the impact of social media on how the scientific discourse is a positive or negative. I think there's, of course, both. But I think in terms of my own personal use, I do find out a lot about papers that I wouldn't have gone looking for from social media, because I follow people in my field and they will tweet about it and say, this is a great work. I see that science Twitter especially is a very, very positive environment for people to share their research. But again, that's not necessarily, I don't know the statistics of the followers of XYZ person, researcher, how many of which are not other researchers, right? Yeah. So that is an echo chamber again, but I feel like it is, in the small slice that I observe it, it is a positive environment for people to reassure each other, ask quick questions about things, and I've seen a few little, fights in terms of calling people out on certain things in papers, or why didn't you cite my paper, or this or that, and so those probably isn't the play to solve those issues, but at the same time, I do see it as, at least as a research-to-researcher tool, it is a net positive. But in terms of scientific reporting, I don't think there's much in terms of a lab's Twitter handle or a scientist's Twitter handle, like communicating their science to the general public in a very effective manner. I don't see that going on too much. It's more on the, for example, Nature, like you said, tweets out every single one and probably calls in at the Crick and at their laboratory, their department, et cetera, to create all the connections, and that's great. But I don't think the researcher is necessarily the person doing that. And I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. I think
it's hard for the general public to work out which is the source that they should be reading for the accurate bit of information,
right,
or knowing whether the scientist is just putting something out there in the hope that other scientists will pick it up and read about it. So
it's mostly the latter, yeah.
Yeah, it's I think the difficulty lies for the general public that wants that information, that wants access, that wants the knowledge, but then has to work out for themselves what to discern, and who to trust, and who is the expert. So I think there's a lot of onus on the general public there to be more discerning. Before we move on, we've got probably about 10 minutes left. Is there any questions from the audience from our panel? Just one couple up here.
Thanks. Hi. I was just wondering about, when journalists get their information from Twitter, and when Twitter storms are reported as news, and talking about people we should trust. someone this morning who said she was an ethics blogger was talking about protected characteristics and said gender when she meant sex. You know, what is this a problem?
I didn't catch the second bit of that question. Sorry, can you repeat it?
So the whole thing was what happens when journalists are getting their information from Twitter, and Twitter storms are reported as news, and some of the stuff that's inaccurate gets churned up into the mainstream. And then you have someone so this morning I picked up someone who asked a question, called herself an ethics blogger, talking about protected characteristics, confused gender and sex, and said gender when she meant sex. Does that matter, really? Is that
So I can answer the first bit. I'm not sure about the second bit. I think one thing I'll tell you that I found really interesting is that somebody was setting up a science media centre in the US, came over to the UK to meet us, and went into the Times newsroom and asked the news editors which teams were getting their stories from Twitter. And apparently she stood in the middle of the newsroom with this guest and looked to, because they all sit in different bits in these newsrooms, so looked to the economics team, 90% Twitter, looked to the politics team, 95% Twitter. I mean, just all of exactly what you're saying. And then looked at the little science team, so Chris Smythe and all of the, Tom Whipple, and they said about 2%. And guess where they get them? Journals. They get them from the journals. So there's nothing quite like science that has this weekly diet of probably 15 to 20 journals with a press operation attached, where the press officers will look at what's in Nature this week, or Lancet or BMJ, and decide the 5 studies that are of public interest and that need a press release. And then that goes into the inbox of every science journalist. So those 3 or 4 stories a day I was telling you about, they are fed by the journals. So I'm not saying they never pick up anything on Twitter. Do you remember the Tim Hunt story? That was a massive story in 2 years ago.
That was gossip.
The sexist professor. I mean, that was front page of the Times for weeks, and that was a Twitter storm. But more than any other subject in the UK, science, health and environment stories are coming via the old-fashioned route of a press release in the journalist's inbox from a journal. And the glory, of course, is their new findings. Again, who else has this? You know, I don't know about anyone else here, but I am so tired of Brexit because nobody's changed their opinion in 3 years. So it's the same people saying the same thing. But you know, there are, whatever about the over-reporting of cancer stories, there are genuinely, authentically new findings on cancer every day. That's an amazing source of stories. So it's maybe why I sound old-fashioned in these things, because there's something about science that has kind of this system that I talked about has stood the test of time, and they haven't found a better alternative.
Well, I think it also adds...
Sorry, I don't know if that answers the question.
It must add confidence as well to the reader to know that it's come, if it's come into the press via the journal itself.
They wouldn't. How would the reader know that? The reader wouldn't know that. But I want to go back to what you're trying... We don't understand what you're trying to ask here, I don't think. Are you saying that this person called themselves an ethics blogger, and by calling yourself an ethics blogger, you should know the difference between gender and sex? Is that what your inherent problem is?
You're putting yourself forward as an expert.
And if you do call yourself an ethics blogger, yeah, I completely agree. You should know the difference between gender and sex. And so, you know, part of that whole Twitter, the reason you get Twitter storms, and less so now than before, was the whole not having a face. So you were this... whatever, you know, a character, or, you know, the knight, or the knightess, or a prince, you know, whatever. Your real identity was not out there, which meant that you could say whatever you want and there were no repercussions. And that was a thing on Twitter. I remember how important that thing was, and the reason that thing was promoted was only big people get a say. Only people who are important get a say, because people are afraid to speak, and, you know, the minorities, or, you know, be it, you know, women are less vocal than men because they feel they're going to be put down. But Twitter, where you don't have to have an identity that's known, allowed you to be whoever you wanted to be without fear of repercussion. Now, I understand the good side of that, but there's a hugely bad side of that too. And that's changing. More and more people don't have a Twitter handle, they have a name. You know who they are, you can trace back to. That whole who said what is important in accurate reporting, because it allows you to do, if you could have looked up that ethics blogger and seen what are the qualifications that allows this person to call themselves an ethics blogger, you will have an ability, an opportunity to make up your own mind of how accurate their reporting might be. And for me, that's a big part of Twitter allowing inaccurate reporting.
So I've got a slightly different question. It's around, I work in quite a regulated science environment where drugs go out to market and their efficacy is proven. How do you have any thoughts or have any ideas as to how you deal with competence, so the competence of anybody reviewing or posting or saying anything, and how you regulate that and how you self-regulate, and also how you deal with conflicts of interest as well, and how you, because that's, everybody has a vested interest, be it in their research, be it in their publications, being in their remuneration or in their royalties or whatever it might be. And I see a lot of that goes on, that you have to ask the really basic questions. Does this work? And, you know, how do you prove that it works? And some data can be manipulated.
Absolutely. I mean, I think what you're talking about is the medical world at large. Conflicts of interest. They were, I would say, they were the first people to actually deal with that whole issue in any way at all. They virtually invented the sort of printing of conflicts of interest on scientific papers, so that you can, to give transparency. And, transparency is the thing here, so that, and it's what we were talking about here as well, so that the reader can then make up their own mind over, one, how much they believe you, and actually have some opportunity to question what you've reported. Scientists question what is being reported all the time. It's part of our makeup. I still call myself a scientist. I'm sorry. I shouldn't apologise for that. We have a questioning behaviour. So do journalists, actually. But the lay public don't. They accept. If it's in print, they accept. And to some extent, they're not even given the opportunity to question, because there's nothing to question. So if you present a conflict of interest, i.e. I'm marketing this drug, or i.e. if I actually sell this drug, I seek to make millions, or I have shares in this drug, you can make up your own mind about whether that person has any vested biases. Transparency in reporting is hugely important, and it's not something that all journals have taken on. At Nature we have, and I'm going to brag and say we pioneered reporting checklists that are published with the papers to show statistical analyses, to ask questions that scientists don't always tell you because it's obvious to them, but when you actually question them, it's not that obvious. And I will give you a very lay example of a thing that a scientist might report. So in animal research, if they're working with mice and you say, how many mice did you use? A scientist will often say, between 10 and 12. No. How many mice did you use? You should know how many mice you use. It's a number, it's an integer. It's not a range. Because if you don't know that starting point, your statistics are biased from that point onwards. Because now you might show higher levels of success. Because if you think you used 8 to 10 or 8 to 12, and you start to use, oh, and then 2 died and 1 ran off, and suddenly, you know, the starting point is 7. Well, you're going to have, and 3 of them, you saw success with 3. Now you're reporting 50% success. But actually, it's 3 of 12. It's 25% success. And it's not wrong in that you try to hide something. It's just the way scientists think. So dealing with conflict, and you know, it's not just the drug world, it's in any scientific research that will have lay accessibility in terms of readership, being transparent, presenting the details that are behind study design, presenting details behind the people and their vested interests to allow the reader to make up their own mind.
Hi there. Yep, fascinating discussion. Thank you. It feels like a lot of the discussion so far has been around almost the reporting of science and how that can be exaggerated and misleading. I think maybe Fiona, you said something along the lines of like doesn't tend to be fake news in science, which is really good to hear. But just wondering what your views are around the debate, perhaps in the States, around climate change and this idea of like, you know, alternative facts and taking the facts, but like interpret them in a different kind of way. And your role as maybe a scientist of like this pursuit of truth, and actually there's only one particular kind of view of the facts. So yeah, just how you kind of marry up some of the debate that's maybe going on over in the States with like climate change.
Who wants to do climate
Shall I volunteer?
change?
So I think, I mean, I'll let you answer about the States, but I generally think it is wrong to call people stupid, and I would include anti-vaxxers in this. I think Magdalena, who's the editor of Nature, was on a similar panel to this in Hay, and the big thing that she kept saying all the time is that scientists have to get out there and engage. So what I think of all of those big debates where there are skeptics, where there are mavericks, where there are noisy, politically motivated people, is that there isn't a science language that everyone has to adopt, but the onus is on us to get out there and argue and debate and challenge. And, you know, this whole thing, Matt Hancock's thing about social media and anti-vaxxers, let's scientists go on, you saying you're doing it all every day, Twitter, let's go on social media and call out every myth about climate change, about vaccination. Let's be there. But I worry about and there is a lot of it about in science, let's close this down. Let's shut down these websites. The demand on the BBC not to ever interview a climate skeptic, which gets very complicated because some of the skeptics are skeptics about what action we take. They do actually accept that climate is happening. So there's a range of skepticism. And I think the BBC, quite rightly, are not going to put balance in every piece. They've stopped all that. And I'm so happy about that, because that really did give the impression that it was 50-50, like with MMR. You know, there was Wakefield had to be in every piece 20 years ago, otherwise BBC journalists were shouting at. So, of course, the public thought, well, medical science is split on whether this vaccine will give my child autism. That's quite a split. So, of course, vaccination levels dropped. So I don't believe in false balance, but I don't think that banning them and coming out, as some scientists do, and saying the truth, the scientific truth is this. And it also leads to exaggeration. So does anyone remember ClimateGate? Which was both the hacking of Phil Jones's emails in UEA, a massive data set, which looked like initially like he might be hiding the decline and kind of suppressing science that disproved. But there was also a mistake in the IPCC report where Greenpeace had put in a report about ice melt, I think it was, the glaciers melting, that was massively inaccurate. And actually that was a real wake-up call for a lot of scientists, because the journalists started mistrusting them. And their editors were saying, well, you've gone native. You told us climate change was happening, but mistakes are made in climate science. There are uncertainties in climate science. So if you only say all the skeptics are wrong, they're all ignorant, all vaccines are safe, that's a very dangerous thing to say. Look at narcolepsy with, I can't remember the vaccine that caused narcolepsy, and journalists actually reported on that. I think it was the HPV vaccine.
I can't remember.
One particular, God, I might be putting my own myth out here. Do not tweet. So there has been an issue with a vaccine and narcolepsy, and it's been withdrawn. So I'm using the opportunity of your question to just say that there are these debates. They're real debates. It's tempting to say Trump, fake news, post-truth, ignorant, let's shut them down. I would say let's embrace them. Let's embrace them. One of the reasons that science is on the front pages is because of these rows. I often think, some of the important papers in the States are actually quite boring. The New York Times and the Washington, they don't even have pictures. I do try and read them when I go over there, but sometimes I think that our tabloids and a media row, human animal embryos, pictures of humans with rabbits' heads, human genome edit, baby with 3 parents, remember that one? But it was front page news. They were a row. The media loved them, but they were on the front pages. And that was a platform for the scientists in the science community to get out there and engage with the wider public. You've all talked about that wider lay public about human animal embryos, about climate change. So be careful what you wish for, even though that wasn't...
I just want to talk to your question about climate change. And the reason that there are debates is you're predicting the future. So nobody actually knows with 100% sort of foresight of what will happen when. It's a bit like the weather. Well, it is the weather. It's going to be sunny next week. Well, I'm told it's going to be sunny tomorrow, but will it be? And our reporting and the way we can assess the weather is pretty good now, but we still get it wrong. But that's not because it's made up, because something else happened. It's the real world. I don't know what's happening out there in outer space. I don't know, what's going to happen for real. And we have to model. So as scientists, we model and we predict. And somebody said back there, statistics, you can literally say what you want, depending on which model you use, what data set you look at. There's implicit human bias in selection of data sets. There is, your model will change according to the number of data points you have. If you have 1,000 data points versus 1 million, and it's very difficult to get 1 million data points. The 1 million is what you want, though. But most studies will have much, much fewer data points. So these are all reported out in scientific papers, and they are as accurate as far as they go.
Yeah.
But it's that foresight of, well, okay, so I've got this little data set, and in my little world, it is true. But from my little data set, I would say in 50 years, the planet's going to collapse. And in that scenario, no one's lying and no one's telling you, an untruth. Or I might say, actually, there's 500 years before climate change has an effect, because in my little data set, that's what it's showing. So what is the truth and what is right? Ultimately, climate change is having an impact. There are a few very, very big, robust studies that can give you that kind of information, but there's a ton of smaller studies, and it's noise. And who bangs which drum loudest? Because they're all scientific reporting.
We've got time for one very last quick question. Lady with the microphone there. Sorry.
It's okay.
It's been touched on a little bit when talking about what is true and whether or not the public should be allowed to make up their own mind and how we should present debates. But what my question is should there be any kind of regulation? And if there is regulation, should it be coming from social media companies? Should it be coming from governments? Should it be regulation on newspapers and broadcast media? And if it, should it, because I'm wondering if there's a difference basically between misleading reporting that comes from a very small sample size, or a completely, basically, a survey that completely lacks credibility. So this private company has surveyed 12 of their customers and it's being reported as a scientific fact, versus the range of skepticisms that exist around what we should do about a problem like climate change and how exactly it will manifest. So obviously there's a huge range of different kinds of misreporting or reporting that might be misconstrued. And I'm wondering if our current system of basically complaining about it is enough.
Or whether there should be stricter regulation.
Yeah.
Tyler, do you have
You know,
a
who
view?
would decide
Yeah.
that?
So the answer to everything, I think, is more vetting. Vetting, vetting, vetting at every single step of the way. The scientist is completely dependent on us to publish something that is correct, to the best of our knowledge. There's always that caveat. And so it's vetted at that level. It's vetted by your peer review, and that just deals with the study part. Despite what many people may say, scientists in general, outside of their work, they can do whatever they want, they can support whatever politically, but we are apolitical, and we should be, all times. Facts do not have, whether something is a target for cancer or whether climate change is caused by human activity is not a political issue, period. Even though it is in my country, but it should not, there's no sides to the facts, period. And so the vetting at every single step of the way, and it's not just responsible for one person, it's not just the scientist, it is on the journal, on the journalist, on everything. At every step of the way, everyone should be questioned, including the public. I know sometimes, we've said it already up here before, it's hard to know what is true and what is not true. But just instilling the idea that you should always just back things up with vetting, and that in most cases will solve 95% of problems when it comes to inaccurate reporting of what is true and what is false. Sure, there's going to be 5% that we did something wrong, and it's going to be wrong every step of the way, and it just gets compounded. So if we made a mistake, whether it was innocuous or we were deliberately trying to falsify our data, that is going to be compounded by every step of the way, but it's that first step of trust with scientists, I totally agree, that what is true and what isn't. And in terms of small studies and things like that, there are so many journals now. Now, how many are in Springer Nature now, or in terms of?
3,000.
Right, so
In
that's a lot of
Springer
journals.
Nature alone.
In Springer Nature alone, which, yeah, so anything can be a study now. And so again, you have to,
Not in Springer Nature.
no.
Springer Nature, but anything can be a study. That is
No, I'm just
absolutely
saying
true.
that there's-
And it's only going to increase with the
And it's
government's
only going to
commitment
increase.
to invest in much more in
So,
research.
but in terms of the regulation, at what level? Social media companies, sure, absolutely. But there has to be, I don't think that we should call for a certain, there's no
quick fix.
No,
There's
I mean,
one thing.
there's the only recent bans recently on Facebook and Twitter and other social media has been on deliberately hateful
Yeah.
misrepresentation of literally everything, and that's the people that have been banned from Twitter, Facebook, YouTube. I'm thinking of one person in particular, but that I don't think the onus is on the social media companies to be that. It's every step of the way.
Yeah. I'm sure other panelists would agree.
Yes.
And on that note, I think we've overrun considerably, so we are going to have to finish here, but please do join me in thanking Fiona, Tyler and Ritu, our panelists today.